Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. Thank you. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you all to tonight's program on the Green New Deal with Aquilina Soriano Versoza and Naomi Klein. Before we get started, I want to quickly mention some museum exhibitions and Hammer programs you might be interested in. First, I'd like to invite you all back to the Hammer to see our new exhibitions of artwork by Larry Pittman, Yoonhee Min, Max Hooper-Schneider, and Yasmina Medwali. Admission to our museum galleries is always free. We also have tons of free public programs coming up. This Sunday and next, art historian John Walsh is here speaking about Van Gogh. On November 2nd, we'll have a Constitution happy hour. It's kind of like a book club with a bar, but the book that we're all reading is the U.S. Constitution. And in the next happy hour, we'll be reading Article 2, which outlines the powers of the presidency and the impeachment process. So feel free to come back and join us for that. And everyone who comes gets a free copy of the Constitution. The next Hammer Forum is on November 12th, and we will be talking about the case for reparations. And on November 26th, labor organizer Ai-jen Poo and Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza will be here in conversation. So we have lots going on at the Hammer, and we'd love to have you all back. One more bit of housekeeping. I want to remind you all to please silence your cell phones, and please note that taking photos and video isn't allowed in the theater, mostly because it's really distracting for everyone else in the audience. We are videotaping tonight's program, and it will be available on our website, so no need for anyone else to videotape. So on to tonight's program. We're really thrilled to have writer Naomi Klein back at the Hammer again on the occasion of the publication of her incredibly important new book, On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal. In this new book, she builds a compelling case for taking the Green New Deal very seriously and using it as a framework to solve the most urgent problems of our times simultaneously. In this intersectional approach to tackling climate change, we can also take on healthcare, transportation, and infrastructure, and creating meaningful jobs with livable wages and treating all our fellow humans with dignity and compassion. As the Wall Street Journal review of the book said, if you're sympathetic to the goals of the Green New Deal, but are as yet unconvinced, as I was before reading On Fire, you need to read this book. Klein marshals the most powerful arguments for why climate change cannot be effectively addressed without a simultaneous, deep reckoning with our society's other ills of wealth and income inequality, racial discrimination, and crumbling infrastructure. And the New York Times reviewer said, if I was a rich man, I'd buy 245 million copies of Naomi Klein's On Fire and hand deliver them to every eligible voter in America. So luckily for you, we have copies of the book available for sale. And not only that, Naomi Klein will stay after the talk and sign copies. So please feel free to buy 245 million copies. And they make great gifts. This evening, we're going to see a very short film and then hear from our guest speakers. And then they'll take audience questions written down on note cards. You should have all received some note cards and pencils on the way in. Those are for you to write your questions on for the question and answer period. When we get closer to the Q&A, we'll send around ushers to collect your cards and bring them up to the stage. If you didn't get a note card or you need some extras, please raise your hand and an usher will bring them to you. Please be sure to write your questions very clearly so that Aquilina and Naomi can read them out loud. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speakers. Aquilina Soriano Versoza is the executive director and co-founder of the Pilipino Workers Center of Southern California, a nonprofit serving and organizing the low-wage Filipino immigrant community in Los Angeles. Aquilina is also the president of the board of directors of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She was the recipient of the 2018 Frederick Douglass 200 Abolitionist Award, and she's an alumna of UCLA. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, columnist, and the author of the New York Times and international bestsellers, The Shock Doctrine, No Logo, This Changes Everything, and No is Not Enough. She's a senior correspondent for The Intercept and a contributor at both The Nation and The Guardian, and she's now the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University. She's also the co-founder of the climate justice organization The Leap. In collaboration with the artist Molly Crabapple, she conceived of and produced the short film called A Message from the Future, which has been viewed online 9 million times. The film features an older Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looking back on the implementation and impact of the New Green Deal from some non-specific time in the future, maybe 2030 or 2040. And it's a really inspiring film that makes me think that maybe, just maybe, if we jump in with both feet and go after this bold, audacious, visionary, inclusive reimagining of our country, then just maybe the Earth and all of us animals living on it can thrive in the future. So we're going to play the film first, and then Naomi will speak. So now enjoy A Message from the Future.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II, We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing-for-the-fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Now please join me in welcoming Naomi Klein.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. I'm going to start with a short reading. It's one that I haven't done before, but we're nearing the 1-year anniversary of the campfire, and fire is in the air once again. So I wanted to read from a chapter of the book called Season of Smoke, and it's about being on summer vacation in British Columbia, where my extended family lives, during the record-breaking wildfires 2 summers ago. A week into the whiteout, the world begins to feel small. Life beyond the smoke starts to seem like a rumor. At the ocean's edge, we can usually look across the Salish Sea to Vancouver Island. Now we strain to see an outcropping of rock a few hundred feet from shore. I've been on this coast for whole winters when we barely saw the sun. I learned to love the steely beauty, the infinite shades of gray chiseled in the mountains. the low sky and the movement of the mist. But this is different. There is a lifeless quality to the smoke. It just sits there, motionless and monotone. I decide the animals are depressed. The seals seem to pop their heads up in a purely utilitarian fashion, just to take a breath and then disappear again beneath the gray surface. They do not play. The eagles, I'm convinced, are flying for function, not fun, no soaring or windsurfing. There's little doubt I'm imagining all of this, projecting. It's a bad habit. I email a friend in Seattle, a prominent environmentalist, to ask him how he's faring in the smoke. He reports that the birds have stopped singing and he is mad all the time. At least I'm not the only one. It begins to strike me how precarious it all is, this business of not being on fire. So far this summer, less than half an inch of rain has fallen in this temperate rainforest. The forest ground cover, usually moist and squishy, crunches underfoot. You can smell the flammability. It's almost a week into the smokeout and the moon is nearing full. But when the almost full moon rises, I mistake it at first for the sun. It's the same strange, same shape and almost the same fiery color. For about 4 days, it's as if we are on a different planet, one with 2 red suns and no moon at all. Looks like snow is coming, my son Toma, just 5 years old, declares solemnly. His face is pressed up to the window and the white, thick air on the other side. Not snow, smoke, I explain, again. His response goes through phases. Nightmares wake him up at night. He writes songs with lyrics like, "Why is everything going wrong?" At first, he was excited by the idea of wildfires, confusing them with campfires and angling for s'mores. Then his grandfather explained that the sun had turned into that weird glowing dot because the forest itself was on fire. He was stricken. What about the animals? We talk in half-truths. The animals know how to escape from the fire. They run to rivers and streams and other forests. We talk about how we need to plant more trees for the animals to come home to, and it helps a little. It's week 2 of the smokeout, and the blackberries are finally ripe. We set out to collect them. It feels strange to be going through this carefree summer ritual with the air so thick and the news so grim, but we do it anyway. Combining hiking with nonstop eating is one of Toma's all-time favorite activities. It's pretty much a bust. With so little rain and such a weak sun to warm them, even the ripest berries are sour. Toma quickly loses interest and refuses to try anymore. We come home with shin scratches and an empty bucket. We don't stop hiking, though. We spend hours a day walking through the stands of moss-covered cedars and Douglas firs, breathing in the super-oxygenated air. I love these forests and have never taken their primordial beauty for granted. Now I find myself in near worship, thanking them not just for scrubbing the air and for the shade and the carbon sequestration they provide, ecosystem services in the lingo of business environmentalism, but thanking them for their sheer stamina, for not joining their burning brethren, for sticking with us, despite our failings, at least so far. These fires are just one snapshot of a much larger season of smoke. At summer's end, large parts of the American West were on fire. A fire in Los Angeles was the largest ever recorded within city limits. A fire-related state of emergency was declared for every single county in Washington state. The area of Europe that has burned this fire season has been triple the average. In June, more than 60 people died in Portugal. Hundreds of homes have burned in Siberia. Even Greenland, that icy place, saw large and unusual wildfires this summer. And yes, it's climate change. It's not the only factor, of course. There's poor forest management and thoughtless development and pine beetles. But overlaying it all is the uncomplicated fact that hotter, drier weather, directly linked to climate change, creates the optimal conditions for wildfires. It's as if the land has been transformed into perfectly laid campfires, with the dry earth acting like balled-up newspaper, the dead trees from bark beetles, serving as kindling, and the added heat providing the match. The soft focus quality the smoke casts over life here makes our collective denial seem more acute. We all look like sleepwalkers, stumbling around, doing our work and errands, having vacations in a thick cloud of smoke, pretending we don't hear the alarm clanging in the background. Smoke, after all, is not fire. It's not a flood. It doesn't command your immediate attention or force you to flee. You can live with it, if less well. You get used to it, and that's what we do. We paddleboard in the smoke and act like it's mist. We bring beers and ciders to the beach and remark that on the upside, you barely need sunscreen at all. Sitting on the beach under that fake milky sky, I suddenly flash to those images of families sunning themselves on oil-soaked beaches in the midst of the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, and it hits me. They are us, refusing to let a wildfire interfere with our summer vacation. During disasters, you hear a lot of praise for human resilience, and we are a remarkably resilient species, but that's not always good. It seems we can get used to almost anything, even the steady annihilation of our own habitat. Our collective house is on fire, with every alarm going off simultaneously, clanging desperately for our attention. Will we keep stumbling and wheezing through the low light, acting as if the emergency is not already upon us? Or will the warnings be enough to face many more of us, to force many more of us to listen? These are the questions still hanging in the air at the end of this summer of smoke. So that's the end of the reading. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I want to thank Claudia Bester again and everybody at the Hammer Museum for welcoming me. And I want to thank Aquilina Versoza for agreeing to be in conversation with me tonight. I'm just delighted to have this opportunity. Aki and I have been talking a lot lately about how the workers that she represents, whose lives are impacted by climate disruption back in the Philippines and also here in California, need to be much more central in the conversations that we have about what a Green New Deal could mean. Because as you saw in that short film, caring for each other is valuable low-carbon work, and it's high time that the women who do that work were paid fair wages and given full labor protections under the law. So I'm not going to talk for too long because I'm looking forward to getting into that conversation and engaging with your questions. The last time I was at the Hammer, it was exactly 5 years ago with the launch of This Changes Everything. And I want to tell you a little story about that evening that's really stayed with me. It was a lovely night and a great crowd. And we had a good signing afterwards. But something really strange happened to me during the signing. A gentleman in his 60s handed me his book, and as I was signing it, he leaned in and he whispered in my ear, "It's time to give up. There's no hope." He said, "From here on in, it's just palliative care. I should know. I'm a psychiatrist." And with that, he was gone. Drive-by hope extermination. I mean, it occurred to me that it was strange that he waited in line for so long just to tell me that. And nobody had actually ever said anything like that directly to me. I had heard the argument. I had read articles to that effect, mostly by literary men of a certain age. And what I found most jarring was how sort of chilled out he was about it. He seemed happy and relaxed, not particularly concerned. That was what was so unsettling, because his desire to convince me to stop trying so hard. He clearly did not feel personally threatened by climate breakdown himself. The death embedded in this idea of too lateness, of give upness, was clearly not a death that he felt he was going to be touched by, whether of the natural world or the people living closest to it. It felt distant, like watching a film whose ending he already knew. And of course, we are here in the city that produces a great many films and television series that take for granted ecological and social apocalypse. Indeed, we have told this story so many times it can begin to feel like prophecy. So I mention this tonight because while that was a new idea to me, when that we should just give up, that it's too late. When I published This Changes Everything 5 years ago, I've now been on the road with On Fire for a little bit more than a month, and I've done dozens of interviews with journalists. And I have to tell you that there is a real shift in the conversation where 5 years ago, or even a couple of years ago, people would really want to engage in the arguments that I was putting forward about the clash between capitalism and the climate, and make the argument that yes, capitalism can fix this, and we can just have a carbon tax that is going to have a good price on carbon and have some innovation and maybe a little geoengineering, but people would passionately argue in defense of our economic system's ability to rise to this crisis, and we would have debates about that. Since On Fire came out, absolutely nobody has marshaled that argument. And almost all the resistance I get comes from journalists telling me to give up, and actually being kind of angry at the idea that I have any hope at all, which I think is an interesting commentary on the state of our media class, who seem to think that they have access to some other planet out there. But I was doing an interview with Boston at Public Radio, and one of the hosts turned to me quite accusingly and said, your cauldron is just overflowing with hope, which I thought the use of the word cauldron was interesting, given New England's history and so on. And my book is called On Fire. It was slightly threatening. But I clarified that my cauldron is not overflowing with hope. I mean, I have quite a bit in that cauldron. There is terror, as you heard. There is grief for what we have lost so needlessly. There is anger at those responsible, some of whom are being sued right now, like Exxon, for who knew and suppressed their research and spread misinformation. And we've lost decades. So I have all of that in the cauldron, but I do have some hope, because there is a path. There is still a pathway where we could rise to this challenge. And it's not about stopping climate change. We are in it. We are in the era of climate disruption, and we're going to see more of it. But we do have a window. And so mostly what I feel is the weight of our historical moment, what it means for all of us to be alive and breathing in 2019, when so many hundreds of millions of lives hang in the balance of what we decide to do or not do. A year ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their report on keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which they strongly recommended that we do. And they said that it is technically possible with existing technologies, but what we need to do is quite extraordinary. They said we would need to cut global emissions in half in 12 years. They said that while it is technically possible to do this, it would require, and this is a quote from their summary, unprecedented transformations in every aspect of society. In other words, this changes everything. So we have this very, very short window, cutting global emissions in half in now 11 years, because that's what happens with time, and total decarbonization of the global economy by 2050. If every ounce of our energy was focused on the transformation, it would be hard enough to pull off a truly epic task. And yet, at this very moment, the men who are rising to the highest office in country after country are not only refusing to douse the flames, they are actively pouring fuel on them. These are true planetary arsonists, determined to torch the planet with glee, convinced that their wealth will protect them and their children. There's Trump, of course, rolling back every environmental law he can get his hands on, cracking open public lands and seas to unrestricted drilling, trolling Greta on Twitter, ogling Greenland, and so on, you know. But it's not just Trump. I mean, this is a global phenomenon in Brazil. There's Bolsonaro, who should not be president of Brazil. Lula da Silva should be president of Brazil. Every poll showed that he would have beat any contender, the most popular politician in the country. He was jailed, railroaded in an incredibly corrupt trial. Bolsonaro came to power promising to roll back indigenous rights, to crack open the Amazon, to unfettered extraction, to cattle farming, to soy farming, monocrops. And the Amazon is still on fire. And Bolsonaro stood before the world at the United Nations a month ago and said that it was all our imagination, that the Amazon is not actually on fire at all. All of these men are at war with physical reality. In Australia, there's Scott Morrison, who went into their House of Government wielding a huge hunk of coal and declared it good for humanity. And that is why they were determined and are determined to dig the world's largest coal mine. All around the world, we are seeing the emergence of these strongman figures. Modi in India, who has not only locked down Kashmir and cut people off from communication now for well over a month, but of course has declared the region open for business, and that this is what this is about. There is Duterte in the Philippines, and what we see with these figures is a certain recipe. The context is different in every country. This isn't a cookie cutter formula, but there are common elements, and they are trading strategies. All of them have this formula where they have this sharply defined in-group within their countries, the sort of real citizens of their respective countries, the people who are within their circle of protection. And then they have these sharply defined out-groups within their countries and on the borders, the criminal, the illegal, the drug dealer, the frightening other, the terrorist, the disease, the invader. And all of this supposedly makes it acceptable to wage war on these out-groups, to tear children from families, to warehouse people in concentration camps, to seal borders to tens of thousands in need. For Trump and his followers, this idea of who is a real American, whose life is worth protecting, and whose is worth sacrificing is, of course, animated by white supremacy. The same is true for the far right in Europe, for Marine Le Pen, for Matteo Salvini, who have created the xenophobic fury that continues to allow thousands to drown in the Mediterranean, but it looks different in different countries. For Bolsonaro, racial hierarchy is a force too, but he's also animated by powerful hatred of the poor, of so-called cultural Marxism, animated by Christian supremacy. For Modi, it's Hindu supremacy. For Netanyahu, it is Jewish supremacy. I guess what I'm saying here is that we are experiencing these two fires. There are the literal fires of climate disruption that I spoke about earlier, but we also are in the midst of these political fires, the fires of hatred that are also raging out of control, jumping from country to country. And I don't think it is a coincidence that these two fires, the planetary ones and the political ones, are raging at the same time. These strongman figures who have come to power around the world are tapping into deep feelings of profound insecurity and scarcity. Some of that flows from 4 decades of neoliberal economic policy, which has systematically made life more precarious. And this is not to say that they represent the people who are hit hardest by these policies. They don't. but they are tapping into the rampant sense of precarity that neoliberalism produces with its attacks on labor protections, shredded social safety nets, opening up chasms of economic inequality in which if you're either a winner or you are a loser, a formulation that was the one and only plot line of Trump's one and only successful business, The Apprentice. They are also, I would argue, tapping into planetary insecurity. And I really don't care if these people claim that they deny climate change or not. We all know on some cellular level that life on this planet is in crisis, that our one and only home is unraveling. No one, no matter how much Fox News they watch, is protected from the feeling of existential terror that flows from that. And what men like Trump and Bolsonaro know, their one true skill is how to make other people's fear work for them. And so they rile up hatred, they weaponize desperation, they run campaigns based on building walls and stopping so-called invasions, and most of all, they sell their respective in-groups the illusion that they will finally be secure in our age of rampant insecurity. You know, I found it so telling that the slogan of the Brexit campaign in the UK was "Take back control," right? This is the illusion that they're selling, that there will be some control. And of course, all of this leaves them free to get on with the real business at hand, plundering the last protected wildernesses of our planet from the Amazon to the Arctic, which of course fuels those planetary fires, the droughts and the superstorms and the floods, the fires that force millions to flee their arid lands, the fires that intensify armed conflicts, which also fuels migration, which in turn is used to fuel those fires of hatred. So I just want to read another very short extract from the book. The rapidly escalating cruelty of our present moment cannot be overstated, nor can the long-term damage to the collective psyche should this go unchallenged. Beneath the theater of some governments denying climate change and others claiming to be doing something about it while they fortress their borders from its effects, there is one overarching question facing us. In the rough and rocky future that has already begun, what kind of people are we going to be? Will we share what's left and try to look after one another? Or are we instead going to attempt to hoard what's left, look after our own, and lock everyone else out? In this time of rising seas and rising fascism, these are the stark choices before us. There are options besides full-blown climate barbarism, but given how far down that road we are, there is no point pretending that they are easy. It's going to take a lot more than a carbon tax or cap and trade. It's going to take an all-out war on pollution and poverty and racism and colonialism and despair all at the same time. So I feel the weight of our historical moment. I feel it every minute of every day. But here is why I don't just give in to the terror and despair. Here is why I do have some hope in my cauldron. And please listen closely because it is important. We do not live in a time of only two fires, the climate fires and the political fires. We live in a time of three fires. There is a third fire, and it is also blazing, and it is our fire. It is the fires of millions of people waking up from that slumber, from that sleepwalking at last. Ours are the fires of the youth climate strikers. 7 million people over 8 days participated in the last global climate strike, which is the largest climate action in the history of our planet by far. Ours are the fires of the indigenous rights movement, putting bodies on the line from the Arctic to Standing Rock, as they have always done, to stop new oil and gas extraction and unrestricted logging. Ours are the fires of the fossil fuel divestment movement. It's worth remembering that the UC system took 7 years, but finally they have announced that they are divesting from fossil fuels, their $80 billion portfolio. Ours are the fires of the climate justice movement, led by racialized communities, frontline communities like those in Los Angeles who have been fighting oil drilling in their backyards for years, that have worked for so many years to create the framework that now goes under the name Green New Deal. Ours are the fires of the Sunrise Movement, and they have a table out front, and I encourage you all to stop by this wonderful new organization led by young people that takes its name from that ball of fire in the sky and put the Green New Deal on the map when they did that incredibly impolite thing of responding to the Democrats' midterm election win, not by throwing a parade, but by occupying Nancy Pelosi's office and demanding a Green New Deal. And creating so much momentum for this idea that the majority of candidates vying to lead the Democratic Party all have to at least claim that they support a Green New Deal. And this framework, which we tried to sort of paint a picture of in that film that you saw, is about putting forward a positive vision of how we can not only get off fossil fuels in line with science, but build a society that is fairer on every front in the process. In the book, I talk about moving from an economy, the kind of economy that we have now, which I call the gig and dig economy, which is about treating people and planet as if they are trash, as if we can extract from both bodies and land without limit, and moving to an economy based on care and repair. And Aki and I are going to be talking a lot about the care piece, but I think the repair piece of it is really threefold. It is about repairing the damage that we have done to the land. It is about changing our relationship with stuff so that we actually start repairing things again and reusing things again, and not and rejecting this culture of constant disposability, because the truth is that even in moving to a green economy, there is a lot of extraction involved in that, in building solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and so on. And if we don't get a hell of a lot better at reusing existing metals and not just throwing things away when we use them a little bit, then we are going to continue the same patterns of colonial exploitation and extraction. So we need to learn to repair our stuff. And we also have this extraordinary opportunity to begin to repair the wounds that date back to the founding of our nations. And one of the ways that we do that is by making sure that the people who have systematically had the worst deal under our current extractive economies, whose lands are destroyed by mining, whose communities have all of the dirtiest industries in their backyards, are first in line to own and control their own renewable energy projects, to get the jobs and the skills and keep the profits from that kind of community-controlled economic development in those communities. So I think that this is a vision that is our best and only chance of putting out both of those fires that I was talking about, by weaving together the need to lower our emissions with universal rights to health care, to affordable housing, to child care, and more, and perhaps most of all, the right to dignified work. It also addresses the underlying precarity that is such flammable kindling for the demagogues of this world. I called the book On Fire because that is what we need to be in this moment. We cannot be sort of in favor of beating these planetary arsonists. We have to be on fire for it. We cannot sort of be in favor of a Green New Deal. We have to be on fire for it. We have to harness the power of fire and start fighting fire with fire. I'm not speaking about the fires of destruction and annihilation. Fire is also a life-giving force. There would be no life on this planet without it. The sunlight turned by plants into the air that we breathe. And for millennia, indigenous people have used controlled burning as a way to prepare land for farming and to prevent wildfires from raging out of control. Fire is a tool to clear away dead wood, the debris in the forest, to fertilize the soil and make way for new growth. That is the life-giving power of fire that we need to locate in ourselves right now when everything is on the line. We need to clear away the debris of whatever is standing in our path that is preventing us from really rising to this historical moment and being in this with everything that we have. We have to figure out what the debris is that is keeping us from really doing this. And I think everybody has some debris, and we just have to find it and burn it off. Maybe it's fear of looking silly. Maybe it's a perfectly understandable fear of falling behind in that cutthroat economy of winners and losers. Maybe it's fear of opening ourselves up to hope and having our hearts broken. Maybe it's fear that once we let ourselves feel how much we stand to lose and how much we stand to gain, we won't be able to stop feeling. We need to figure out what is holding us back, find our fire, and clear away the debris. And then we need to get into this fight for real, because we have a hell of a lot of debris out there to clear away. We need a fire that burns bright and hot enough to clear away the debris of the deniers, the ones who continue to take money from fossil fuel companies to spread lies and confusion about whether we are in a crisis at all. We need a fire that burns bright and hard enough to clear away the debris of the distractors, who are so adept at getting us to look at every new distraction and shiny object and interesting tweet and keeping us off course. We need a fire that burns hot enough to clear away the debris of those doomers, like that gentleman I was mentioning, and maybe some people who write for The New Yorker, telling us that it's all too late, so why not just let it burn anyway? And most of all, our fire needs to clear away the debris of the dividers, turning us against one another when we need to be more united, more powerful than we have ever been before. So I want to leave you with some words from the student climate strikers in the UK. They say, Greta was the spark, but we are the wildfire. And that's what we need to be. We have to be the wildfire. Thank you. She's coming.
Hello, how are you tonight? Are you on fire?
Maybe some slow embers. It's a slow burn with this crowd, I can tell. Aki, can I ask you I would just love for you to talk to folks here a little bit about the work that you do and how you see it intersecting with the kinds of themes that we've been talking about.
So the Filipino Workers Center and the National Domestic Worker Alliance, we organize domestic workers. In Filipino Workers Center, we primarily focus on caregivers who care for our elders in their own homes usually, or in small boarding care facilities, and often are making less than minimum wage, no overtime. We have caregivers who are making as little as like $2.50 an hour with no overtime, working around the clock. And actually, we domestic workers were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act in the 1930s during the New Deal time period. So until just very recently, we won the California Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which after 75 years of exclusion, we actually have rights for overtime for domestic workers. Yes. But there are still many states in the United States that don't have their own state laws for this, and we actually are still excluded at the federal level from a lot of the protections. Basic right to organize, um, for caregivers, even excluded from minimum wage and overtime protections. Until very recently, there was a policy change, but when the administration changed, it has not been put into practice. So, in effect, in many states across the nation, caregiver could be paid $1 an hour and that would be legal. They could be paid a penny an hour and that would be legal because they're not protected by basic minimum rights laws. So you might think it's strange to think about domestic work and workers' rights and the Green New Deal. And actually, it wasn't until more recent that uh, we started thinking about this. Because caregiving is actually one of the fastest growing jobs, careers in the United States right now. Every 8 seconds, someone turns 65 in this country. So we have a whole demographic shift happening. The baby boomers are coming into retirement years. And so exponentially, we have our population shifting this way. So exponentially, we have this need growing for care. And almost everyone, when you poll them, wants to actually age in their own communities and age in their own homes. But we have this crisis right now of care that we don't have actually enough caregivers. So we were thinking about this because there has to be a shift in the economy when we think about climate, right? Away from extractive and polluting industries. And one of the fastest growing jobs is caregiving, right? Because this is a basic care infrastructure that we need. Caregiving and domestic work is actually the work that makes all other work possible. It's a basic infrastructure of our society that actually makes everything run, right? Domestic work, both unpaid and paid. That's right. And as we shift and we change our economy, we need, like in the New Deal, to invest in infrastructure, right? There is this vision of creating transportation, electrifying the rural communities, right? And creating this basic infrastructure that actually sets us up as a whole society to be successful. And we also need that kind of investment into our care infrastructure for our society to continue to be successful and whole, so that people can actually go to work also. But also, caregiving is definitely a low carbon job, right? It is not extractive. It is a part of that care and repair as we're building whole communities. But there's this other connection because caregivers in this country and actually around the world, a lot of caregivers are immigrants. And like the Filipino caregivers that I work with, we are impacted, especially being an island nation, by this climate crisis. We're already being immensely impacted by it. I don't know if you remember Super Typhoon Haiyan that happened a few years ago, right? One of our caregivers lost 2 of his sisters, swept away from the beach, swept away from their home, never found again. And so our people are actually climate refugees being displaced by this crisis, but also the immigrants here, our families are being impacted. And you smell it in the air, right? Even here in California, we're impacted already as well. So with the wildfires that are happening, Pacific Palisades is burning right now, right? But domestic workers and caregivers are actually some of those impacted, especially in these rural areas and vulnerable areas. And actually, I think we spoke about this last time. the people who are most vulnerable to actually dying in the wildfires of what they've been finding is actually the elderly, right?
Elderly and disabled. That was what was very, very clear in Paradise. And I was just there a few weeks ago, and it was, as we know, more than 80 people died. But if you look at the list of folks, it lists their age, and it's very clear that 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 you know what climate disruption does is it intensifies pre-existing vulnerabilities, right? So people who have mobility issues and who are alone, right? This is who died in Paradise. So it was the elderly, it was the disabled, who just weren't able to evacuate. But at the same time, and I'm sure many of you remember these images that we all saw of just like heroic nurses and care workers rescuing the people in their care, right? And who became first responders during that emergency. And we see this again and again. I mean, think about those images from Houston during Hurricane Harvey. You might remember those like harrowing images of elderly people in a care facility, right? With the water rising. Well, those people survived, and they survived because the care workers who were with them saved them, and they, got people there to rescue them. It's the people who die in these, who are truly vulnerable, are the people who are alone and isolated. And so this is one of the things that that I think in our analysis of the climate crisis, we don't have a very strong gender analysis. It's just a fact. It's one of the weakest parts of the analysis. And women are saving lives all the time in these crises, in these disasters. And it is low carbon work. And it doesn't get recognized as low carbon work. And we can't, sometimes when we talk about a Green New Deal, we gloss over some of the difficult choices that we're going to have to make, right? We act as if it's just going to be like flipping a switch. We can have the exact same sort of way of life, except for now we're going to get all of our energy from renewables and everything will be fine. But the fact is that we are going to have a different kind of economy that is where we are not measuring progress through endless consumption and endless growth. And that's going to have to, but there are parts of our economy where we can have abundance, and we need to identify the parts of our economy where we can have abundance. And all the social science shows us that when we invest in that infrastructure of care, we actually get happier. We're less stressed, right? I mean, we did a panel together recently which brought together home care workers, nurses, and teachers, and disability rights activism. And it was really beautiful. It was an all-women panel talking about what people could do if these jobs were good jobs, right? If we invested in them to make them good jobs. One of the people on the panel was Emily Comer, who was one of the key leaders of the West Virginia teacher strike that really set off this whole wave of job actions. And she said, well, if we invested in education, we could have smaller classes. If we could have, instead of 30 some students, we could have 12 students, and we'd all be able to do our jobs in the way that we actually want to be able to do our jobs. That's the kind of thing that actually improves quality of life for everybody, builds real security and resiliency. And so, what would that look like that kind of thing look like in the care sector? Like, what are the investments that we would need to make, that we could make, that would lower emissions? We talked about transit, but also just make these better jobs. That's the key thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely caregivers, domestic workers do rely on public transit. So if we're able to, and a lot of times they're working out in far areas and stuff. So, so creating good, no emission transportation would be one way. Also, caregivers do a lot in managing and helping create a good quality of life, but they're there on a day-to-day basis, and they can also help to like navigate the people that they're caring for, like to resources and to help implement things that would actually make homes greener spaces as well. And the domestic worker movement is a whole fire in itself, where domestic workers are not only looking at working conditions, but they're also looking at the dignity of work. You said this economy is a gig and dig economy right now, right? And actually, domestic workers are like some of the original gig economy workers. We've been in the same conditions in terms of like isolated, treated as kind of independent contractors, no benefits, no job security for a long time. So we have a lot that we've learned about how we're starting to transform this. And so we are looking at not only transforming our industry, but how to really build leaders to transform our democracy. So there can be a great infrastructure both in the communities to actually be first responders that like is already there, but then also really help join together in leadership and to move this forward, because it's going to take a huge movement to bring this transformation together to actually have a Green New Deal.
So one of the things that I think we're really up against when we think about this kind of transformation is, there's all the obvious challenges, right? All the obvious blockages, all that debris that I mentioned earlier, right? But there's something else, which is, I think, inside our movements, which has to do with silos, right? Where we can sort of intellectually understand all of these issues are connected. We're not talking about a narrow climate policy. We're talking about the next economy and what that looks like. And that's something that can only be, if it isn't going to replicate the injustices of the original New Deal, and if it is not going to create new sacrificial people, then everybody has to be at the table. But there isn't really a table to be at, because we don't really have the kind of broad-based left. We haven't invested in that infrastructure, right? We have a lot of NGOs. We have a lot of people working in specific issues, and we don't have a lot of places where we cross-pollinate, right? And I think everybody can sort of, at this stage, talk a good game about intersectionality, but that doesn't mean that we actually have the institutions to enact it, So, you talked about, that people haven't reached out to domestic workers about a Green New Deal. You're not really part of this conversation. Emily said the same about teachers. To some extent, this is true about healthcare workers. So, what do you think? How do we get out of these issue silos to actually? And part of what we've talked about a little bit is like, are there any lessons from the Philippines? Because the Philippines has a very, very different political framework. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is our challenge, because one, I think so many organizations are focused on very short-term goals, the SMART goals,
Right.
but we don't come together. So in the Philippines, it's very different. We have different sectors where there is focus in different areas. There's women, there's workers, there's youth, but what's different is that there is a shared analysis of what is wrong. What are the root causes of all the issues that everyone is facing? And so then there is a common understanding of really how all of these issues and sectors come together in like a very deep way. I've been with farmers, peasants, who on like a tarp of like tire can break down with chalk the problems in terms of imperialism and how it relates to the world, as well as like the basic problems of the political structure and the economic structure, and it can tell you exactly who, even name families who are the actual 1%. So we know the issue, we know 1%. Who here can actually name who are the families, who are the people who are the 1%, right? So like they have that kind of analysis, we have that kind of analysis so that we come together at times. So we know that there are super critical things that we have to come together around. And so you have specific focuses, but then everyone is working together in a larger strategy and you come together. So we need that kind of focus here in the United States. We need to bring all of these issues together because you can't really solve one only, right? Because they have common roots. If the inequality gap, racism, and climate, gender issues, all of these are connected. And this basic extractive economy is actually, and the commodification of people and planet are really at the heart of it all, right? And so that means that we can't just talk about it. We have to come out and actually be there with each other. We have to with our bodies, with our actions, actually show up for each other in different spaces. So even if this is not my specific issue, it's important that domestic workers know about it and domestic workers are actually showing up. Because that's the only way it's going to happen, by actually people coming together, sharing, teachers, domestic workers, the youth climate activists, all coming together and sharing. That's how we actually building relationships with each other and across memberships is also really key.
Yeah, and I think there also needs to be resources to do the kind of deeper deliberative work, because the Green New Deal resolution that was drafted by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey, it calls for this process to be designed democratically from the ground up. I mean, it has some sort of principles that it lays out, and including setting these these emission reduction benchmarks and these sort of core principles of being led by frontline communities and so on, and the key policies that are in it. But then it says each of these constituencies need to democratically decide what the Green New Deal is in their communities and their constituencies. But the problem is that the people who kind of most need to be at the table have the least capacity because they're in daily emergencies, right? So there's no mention of migrants in that resolution, which is pretty bizarre, really, and migrants need to be part of this discussion. You represent the workers that you represent are reflect that, but it's also migrant workers who rebuild after every single disaster in this country and then face deportation, right? So you have migrant workers on the front lines, of this sort of unrecognized first responder work that care workers are doing. And then you have the people who are clearing away the debris, who are rebuilding the homes, and then are in situations that are so precarious that they're rewarded for that work, in many cases, literally with deportation.
And also access to relief resources as well. Yeah. If you have immigration, if you're undocumented, it's very difficult to access the resources at the same time. We had a caregiver who helped his client. There wasn't a plan in the care home that he worked at to really get everyone out, so he had to really just rig something together in order to get his client out because they were non-ambulatory. He was literally wheeling them down the street as the fire was on their backs. They survived, and he was able to get everyone from that care home out. So the folks that he was caring for were then relocated to new care homes. And what happened to him is he became jobless. And because he was undocumented, he also couldn't access the relief services as well. So what he would do is he would go to the care homes where his clients were relocated and help them with some physical therapy and things that he knew that they needed. But at the same time, he was really worried and he was trying to figure out how to also care for his family.
And then, here in California, you have the added injustice that so many of the people who are fighting the fires and doing some of the most dangerous work are being paid, what, $2 a day as inmates. So this is, and where are they in part of this discussion for a Green New Deal, right? So I mean, the point is that the people who most need to be part of this discussion are sort of institutionally kept away from the table, either like, when it comes to incarcerated people, obviously physically kept away. But in so many cases, it's just a capacity issue, right? The people who are dealing with the deportations, are most precarious, are not resourced to think about what does a Green New Deal mean in our sector, right? And so I think that's something that we all need to be pushing. Those of us who are part of the climate movement is, it can't just be the people who get to the table easily. And that, I think, is part of what we wanted to get across tonight. I think we're supposed to take some questions, right? I think so. Are we at the question time? I think so, because we right. I think. All right.
So there's
yeah.
ushers that are coming down, and we'll collect your note cards, and then we'll be able to answer some of your questions. Well, while they're collecting,
Yes.
it just you made me think about like why this is so important that the Green New Deal it's not just about solar panels, it's not just about climate, because we need such radical transformation to actually get to the point where we're cutting the carbon, where we're eliminating carbon emissions and cutting enough in the next 11 years that having the total transformation is so important to getting so many people together to build this movement. And that's why, like, it's not just for the principle of it that you need to have everyone at the table. It's really because, especially those who are most impacted, are going to be so motivated to move it and to create a change. It's not just because it will motivate. I've heard you say that, it will motivate people, and having these people along, having everyone together is because if they can imagine a better tomorrow or a better next week, right? Versus just thinking about, this is like, versus apocalyptic world, like people are going to be much more engaged.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is because I still often do hear this argument from folks inside the climate movement who, are terrified, understand how little time there is, and will make the argument that, why can't we just solve climate change first and then deal with, racism and inequality? And, we have this very short window, like, let's just get this done. Why are you making it harder by kind of weighing down climate with all of these other sort of intractable problems? And I've heard this whispered. I've also seen it written down by some of our, leading climate voices. And I mean, not only is it kind of morally bankrupt, in my opinion, because if you're changing the building blocks of society, why on earth would you not multitask and deal with the fact that we live in a time of multiple overlapping crises? So if we're changing the building blocks of our society, why would we replicate existing inequalities, exclusions, and injustices? But I also think that but setting the morality aside here for a minute, it's also just, it seems to me really unstrategic, because we are up against such powerful enemies who have trillions of dollars on the line, and fight really hard and dirty to keep us from doing anything about the climate crisis, and have been incredibly successful at it. And the people who fight hardest for deep change are the people who have the most to gain from change. And I think for a long time, the environmental movement has and this is not true of the environmental justice movement, but the sort of mainstream green movement has sort of believed that this can be led by, middle class, relatively comfortable, predominantly white people who are actually pretty afraid of change. Arundhati Roy says that sort of middle class environmentalism asks the question, how can we change without changing? So it's sort of, and if you think about this sort of the way we've been sort of talking about climate for a few decades, it's always been like, what is the least we could do in the face of this crisis? Like, can we just change our light bulbs? Is that possible? Can we all get Teslas? Can there be some really complicated market in pollution that we create that we'll barely notice? And I think it's because the people designing those responses feel threatened by change. And the fact is that won't lower emissions. But to build the kind of muscular movement that will really fight, the incentive is that it's not better than a future of ecological and social breakdown and every sort of apocalyptic future we've, imagined thanks, to with the help of Hollywood, but that it's better than Tuesday. Like, it's better than existing reality for the majority of Americans if we actually get this done. And that's why we need to unite these issues, not to slow it down, but actually to speed it up, because people want healthcare and they want dignified jobs and they want better services in their communities. And, in France, we saw what it looks like when Emmanuel Mccall imposed a carbon pricing scheme at the same time as he attacked labor rights, imposed economic austerity, handed out tax breaks to billionaires, and suddenly asked working people to pay more for gas. And all of a sudden, Paris is on fire. And the slogan of those protests was, you care about the end of the world, we care about the end of the month, right? And if we don't figure out a way to allow people to care about both, we're going to lose and lose again. And that's what we've been doing.
There's a lot of questions here.
Oh my God, there's an entire other book there. All right. Here, pass me half. You find some and I'll find some.
Okay.
Some of them are quite long. I'm going to read all your questions. I might not be able to. Some of these are quite poetic. Water is life. I'm with you.
This one says, question from Andrea Leon Grossman. Even though the UC system divested from fossil fuels, it hasn't stopped taking money from them for their chemical engineering program or even their sustainability program from the gas company. How do you see them stopping taking dirty money once and for all? Well, that's going to take some organizing and a campaign to make them stop, I believe, because they're not going to just do it, right? Students, teachers, employees, and California residents, I think, will need to organize around that.
So I've got a couple that are on theme. Is reform enough, or do we need revolution? Can we really implement a Green New Deal without dismantling racial capitalism? So I would say that, so can we really implement a true, can we achieve the goals of the stated goals of a Green New Deal within racial capitalism? No, we cannot. Do we have to overthrow this entire system before we get started? No, we cannot. We have to start now. But I think what we need to do is we need to prioritize those policies that pull things out of the market logic, right? This is why, like, a really good fight is, free transit, the right to transit for everybody. And this is why my friends in London made such a mistake a couple weeks ago by having well, not actual friends of mine, but I don't know if you saw the footage of Extinction Rebellion blocking the tube at rush hour in one of the poorest neighborhoods in London. And, as my friend Astrid Taylor pointed out, they should have done what folks did during Occupy, which is jam open the turnstile and give everybody a free ride. So you prefigure the future that you want. If you're going to get arrested for something, why not get arrested for that? But so I think that I think what we need to do is we need to prioritize those those types of policies that are utterly outside of a capitalist logic. And we need to drag more and more of our economy out of that logic. We also need to make sure that there is a strict carbon audit on everything that we do under a Green New Deal. And that is going to force us to confront the logic of consumption and growth. Because, I know from having studied this for a long time that it is absolutely impossible to hit these emission targets within a capitalist logic of growth. That doesn't mean that there are no parts of our economy where we can have abundance. That's why this conversation about care is so important. We can have, what's sometimes called public luxury and private restraint. So there is going to be restraint in how much we consume, we being over-consumers who are represented in this room. But we can have abundance in those areas which we actually know produce well-being, like access to nature, access to the arts. This is where I think, despite all of the cautions in the original New Deal and recognizing all of the people who were systematically excluded, particularly African-American workers in agriculture, in domestic work, but also the systematic discrimination within the relief programs under the Green New Deal. Actually, one of the standouts under the original New Deal were the arts programs, which provided unprecedented public funding for African American artists and Indigenous artists. Hundreds of thousands of works of art were created under New Deal arts programs. So art is low carbon work. We can afford to have abundance in it. So that's how I'm going to answer that question. And speaking of which, how do you see the relationship of population growth to climate change? Why do activists seldom mention population growth? Because 70% of emissions come from the 20% wealthiest people on the planet. And the truth is that this is often a way of changing the subject from the consumption habits of wealthy, mostly white people, to the procreation habits of poor, mostly Black and brown people. So that's why I don't talk about it.
This one, I want to stay hopeful, but given the risk we still face, what do you think about people bringing children into the world? Justice for them, environmental impact.
Yeah, I honestly get this question from a lot, particularly of young women. This book tour I've been on, I've partnered with the Sunrise Movement, so I've met lots of young women who are part of that movement, and a lot of whom privately have asked me if I think they should have kids. I know that a lot of young climate activists, in their 20s now and younger, think about whether or not it is ethical to have kids, and what I say to them is that it's still their choice, that nobody should tell anybody whether or not they should have kids or not. And we really do need to understand the history of forced sterilization, which is very real, and it's not just history, because when women's reproduction gets instrumentalized and weaponized in this way, for some greater good, really terrible things happen. And this is why, even though I know that access to contraception and reproductive freedom is probably a part of a climate solution, I never make that argument. I defend that on their own merits, right? I don't defend reproductive freedom for any other reason that women deserve it, right? Because as soon as women's bodies get instrumentalized for some other goal, we lose control over that. So I just want to send that caution out. Now, in terms of the question of whether or not we have kids or not, I think it's really healthy that young people are asking these questions and having these conversations with each other, because there's a lot of grief in this moment and there's a lot of fear, and I don't think that people should deny that these questions arise. It was certainly a factor for me in why I didn't decide to have kids until I was very old. But what I do know is that kids are coming. People are going to have kids, whether we personally decide to have kids or not. There will be millions more kids coming, probably billions. And so sort of rather than hand-wringing about whether or not we personally are going to add to those kids, we need to focus our attention on how we are going to create a future in which those kids are able to thrive.
That's right. Yeah. Because after all, it's an act of hope also. How about, can you paint a picture of how to facilitate the use of indigenous knowledge?
So I don't know that I could paint that picture, but I would really encourage people to read something called the Red New Deal, which is comes from a group of indigenous scholars and activists who've come together to map what the answer to this question might look like. And the Red New Deal is not instead of the Green New Deal. It's an example of what we're talking about, of like different communities and constituencies self-organizing and saying, we are going to define what a Green New Deal would mean to us. And that includes indigenous leadership and knowledge informing the rest of the Green New Deal. And so, I mean, one of the cautions and there are so many cautions from the original New Deal, but indigenous rights were violated in these, mega dams that, Tennessee Valley authorities and so on projects. But also, I think one of the most exciting pathways would be thinking about, we know we need a lot of reforestation. We know we need a lot of land rehabilitation because we actually need to draw down a lot of carbon, right? It isn't just about getting our emissions to zero. We have put so much carbon into the atmosphere that we need to draw it down, and one of the ways that we do that is through rewilding and practicing agroecological farming, and so indigenous leadership needs to inform this. The original New Deal gives us an example in the Civilian Conservation Corps, right, which was one of the most popular programs under the original New Deal. People forget that during the original New Deal, they weren't only facing the crisis of the Great Depression, they were also facing the ecological crisis of the Dust Bowl and a crisis of deforestation. And so more than 2 million young people were employed by the Civilian Conservation Corps, sent to hundreds of camps across the United States to do soil restoration work and to plant trees. And they planted 2.3 billion trees, which is more than half the trees ever planted in the United States. They also built 800 state parks based on this idea that people have a right to access nature, that will actually lift the spirits of the nation. This is something that FDR really believed really strongly, that the nation was not just economically depressed, that people were depressed, right? And so part of the project, and this is why there were these huge investments in the arts, but also in access to nature, people needed to have their spirits lifted, and the arts and access to nature does that, right? But I think, unlike the original Civilian Conservation Corps, which built like libraries in the middle of forests for people to read books about forest management, it would be kind of amazing to model this on the sort of indigenous knowledge leadership that we saw at Standing Rock, where a lot of people, went there and learned, how to live on the land, or got a glimpse of it anyway.
So I think we're actually at time already.
All right.
Yeah. Is there a final question you want to?
Should there be an upper age limit for voting? And/or should we lower the voting age to 16 so Greta can vote? I don't think she can vote in the elections here. But, God, there are so many good questions. I'm going to read them all and, maybe tweet some responses because they really are great. How comprehensive are the Dem presidential candidates on the Green New Deal plans? What do you feel need to be addressed? So I'm just going to wrap up here. So not all the leading candidates support a Green New Deal. One leading candidate does not support the Green New Deal, and that's Joe Biden. He does not support a Green New Deal. He continues to take money from polluters, even though he says he doesn't take money from fossil fuel executives. He does seem to have fundraisers at their houses. I think it's dangerous to count Biden out, and I'm pretty worried about it, to be honest. Well, especially now, because we can't have a candidate who has their hands tied behind their back and can't go after Trump in some of the areas where he is most vulnerable, including the fact that his family is incredibly corrupt, right? And it's clear that Biden would not be able to go after Trump on that because, his son worked for a fossil fuel company while his father was opening up, fracking frontiers. And the only main reason they were interested in Ukraine was natural gas. So it may have been legal, but it was highly unethical. And it is not the kind of fossil fuel nepotism that we need right now. So Biden's a disaster, and we cannot act as if he's out of the game. We really need to organize and vocally take on Biden. So that was my attempt to do that.
And here in California, the primary is going to be important in California because we moved up the deadline. So it's going to be important that California turns out for that primary in March.
I guess I also want to say that to me, there's no contest in terms of whose Green New Deal plan is the best. Bernie is the only candidate. I'm not just saying this to be partisan. So there is no climate justice that stops at the U.S. border, okay? This is a global crisis, and the United States is the world's largest historical emitter. So the U.S. is not going to lead by example, as I've heard people say. The U.S. is going to lead by ponying up some serious cash and paying its climate debts, to countries like the Philippines and other countries that are on the front lines of climate disruption and did very little to create this crisis. And Bernie is the only candidate that has consulted with the world's leading experts on what climate equity globally actually means. And that's how he came up with this figure of committing $200 billion to pay into the UN Climate Fund. And nobody else is talking about this. And so I'm just going to bang on about that. I'm also going to bang on about the fact that you can't green the military, okay? What you need to do, because it is the world's largest driver of ecological disruption and not to mention human misery. So what we need to do is cut, and this is what Bernie is proposing to do, is cut funding from the military and move it over, right? So I really do think that these are very, very important differences, and I think that Warren should be pushed on this, and I think she can be pushed on this, and so but I also do think it is significant that in the last debate, Bernie was the only candidate who, despite not being asked about climate change, kept talking about a Green New Deal. Because the thing is, if you say you believe in a Green New Deal, you don't need to be asked about it, right? It is your plan for the next economy. You talk about it when you're talking about jobs. You talk about it when you're talking about foreign policy. You talk about it, when you're talking about agriculture. You talk about it all the time. It's like FDR being like, nobody asked me about the New Deal, so I didn't talk about it. It is a framework. Everything fits inside it, so you don't have to be asked. It should be in your stump speech. It is your framework. I guess the last point I just wanted to end on, I guess, relates to this youth, the youth question. We are seeing incredible leadership from young people right now. It's a very beautiful thing, and I know a lot of the young people who have been leading these strikes. I've had the privilege of meeting with them on this tour. It's really, really hard, Greta's speech at the UN when she said, "You stole my childhood," really was heartbreaking. But it's not just Greta. Many of the young organizers who I'm meeting know this is not what they should be doing. This is not what they want to be fighting for. Do you think that Little Miss Flint wants to be spending her childhood fighting, to get water without lead in it? This is not what kids should be doing. They shouldn't be fighting to keep guns out of their schools. They shouldn't be fighting to keep lead out of their water. They shouldn't be having to fight for a livable future. They should be allowed to be kids. But this is what they're being forced to do, and they are rising to that challenge. What I really think is dangerous is the idea that this is a youth issue. Yes, young people are going to live in a climate-disrupted future for longer than people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. But if you look at the timelines that we're talking about, people who are in their middle age and even younger are absolutely going to be feeling the effects of this crisis. We who are in our middle age, we will be those elderly people when things really get out of control. And what we know, and this is what's so key about Aquilina's work, is that age is an intent. It makes us far more vulnerable. And so this is what I've been saying to audiences recently to try to motivate people who are not young, which is that at least the young people will be able to run. We really need climate action. No, but I think if young people...
or you need caregivers to help you.
We need an intergenerational movement, is the truth. We need an intergenerational movement. We need to share knowledge, but we also need to share this burden. If young people are giving up their recesses, their lunch hours, their weekends, their evenings to try to build this incredible global youth movement, and they are doing it, then we all have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to give up? What are we willing to do in order to be in this at that same level of intensity? Because the world's on fire, and we have to be too. Thanks, everybody.